question before you was, to what extent do these sort of formal methods that people are talking about, game theory, probability theory, decision theory, to what extent do they lend insight to real-world type situations of scientific inference where you get your hands dirty? So the proposition before the House to debate, yesterday we had a paraphrase of one great philosopher, and so I'd like to quote another great philosopher, the late great Richard Jeffrey. True or false? We care whether pig farmers are Bayesians. Whether pig farmers are Bayesians. And I mean that metaphorically too, for do formal methods really matter in the real world where you get your hands dirty?
Yeah, you said it about Clark.
Do they provide illumination?
Dirty for science, right?
Right. Yeah. 30%.
What do pig farmers care about bays? Is that the
Right, exactly. Yeah. Alan, do you want to start out?
I just wrote some notes and I can't find them. Did I leave them up there? I was really getting ready for this anyway. Good, that helped. Can I answer the question about science? Does it have to be about pig farmers?
No, answer the question about science.
Yeah. So for start, Bayesianism is a flexible framework, so you can model beliefs about pretty much any subject matter. It might as well be scientific subject matter, so no problem there. To be sure, it's highly idealized. Don't see a problem there either. Frictionless planes are highly idealized. That's not a problem for appealing to physics. Now, there's been various success stories, using Bayesian methods for illuminating episodes in science. Different ways of doing it. On the one hand, you've got sort of Dawling style, just sticking in particular numbers, imagining scientists had these particular probabilities and then seeing what happens to them. I prefer sort of more robust reconstructions where you look over what range of probabilities you'd still get the same results. I like, say, Alan Franklin's reconstructions. Now, various familiar problems with the Bayesian methods, the problem of the priors, the problem of explaining the quick convergence to agreement that we apparently have. Now, here, the Bayesian is quick to appeal to various convergence theorems, starting with two discrepant agents. There'll be a data stream sufficiently rich to bring them arbitrarily close to agreement. This is all well and good, but they're also glass half full theorems, and just by a simple alternation of the quantifiers, you get glass half empty theorems. For any data set, however rich, there'll be two agents so discrepant that they won't be anywhere near each other, even after updating on that data set. So one doesn't want to overstate the epistemological significance of these results. And there are the various familiar bugbears, the paradox. It seems in a way that Bayesianism is such a broad church that it will rationalize too much. Like you can rationalize the gambler's fallacy by suitably counterinductive priors. All right, so all that said, things I like about it, just its richness, that it can piggyback on this whole rich probability theory and statistics, nice connections to decision theory, confirmation theory, causal modeling. As for answering these skeptical challenges, maybe that's not its job description. We don't think it's the job description of traditional epistemology to provide decision theory and confirmation theory and to illuminate the use of probabilistic methods in science. So maybe we can have a sort of division of labor, but some of the labor is taken up by Bayesianism and some of it by other methods. And the things that it does very well, illuminating various features of confirmation, how surprising evidence seems to give special confirmatory boosts, diverse evidence is good when you can get it and it confirms your theory. Klein Duhem problem. John talks about these nice cases in his book. Of course, then there are also problems like the problem of old evidence. Anyway, so a slightly mixed answer there, but yeah, I want to pay Bayesianism its due, both science and I guess the pig farmers. I didn't talk much about that.
So I guess I think that the value in pursuing these kinds of methods in philosophy, I mean, as we do, is actually very quite substantial, I think. So let me talk about two kinds of cases where I think it really makes a difference that there are people in philosophy departments thinking about probability, decision theory, and other things. So here I think is one. You know, if you went back to about 1985 in any statistics department in the world and said, should you be involved in talking about causation or counterfactual inferences, they'd have said no. Right? And the only place it was really happening was in philosophy, where you know people were people were thinking so seriously about causation. There were sort of these accounts, these kind of improbabilistic accounts of causation, you know, that developed over the years. So Brian added to these things, and it seems to me sort of, you know, and leading up to the work of the CMU group, you know, on sort of causal modeling, and it turns out that, you know, these kind of concepts, the concepts of causation and inference, you know, inference involving some causal connections and things like counterfactuals, turn out to be, you know, becoming increasingly important in statistics. It turns out that actually so statisticians are sort of realizing that, you know, you have to be able to handle these kinds of things. So I noted that Don and Ruben, I think, was inducted into the National Academy of Sciences last week, 2 weeks ago, right? And you know, what he does is he's interested in causal reasoning in statistics and counterfactuals. And the fact is, the kind of tools, you know, in a different sort of mathematics, the kind of tools that are being used are exactly the sorts of things that philosophers were talking about and developing. So I think that one kind of thing which is sort of quite good about us thinking about these kind of formal tools in philosophy is that it's very often the case that because there aren't as many constraints on our discipline to get grants and things like that, that we're able to sort of pursue issues like trying to understand causal inference, right, in contexts when the scientists aren't. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is, I think it is awfully important to sort of have people who understand some of the limitations of certain kinds of inductive methods, right? And who think about those questions on a regular basis. So I had an experience recently. I think I told Al about this, but I gave a talk to a cognitive science group, right? And it was kind of a introductory talk about the value of sort of Bayesian approaches to various kinds of inference problems. And there are a lot of Bayesians in the audience, right? But after the talk, they all came up to me and they said, but you know, we learned our Bayesianism from E.T. James, right? And they had this picture of what Bayesianism was, and that's a very interesting view, but it's also a view that is kind of important to understand what the limitations are. And you know, that's a very valuable thing to do, I think, and it's the kind of thing that we philosophers tend to do it, and end up, you know, tending to think about, right? What are the kind of limitations on these methods? What are their advantages and disadvantages? And so I think, you know, as far as we're engaged in that business, it's great.
Well, I suppose it's my job to be contrarian on this, and if so, I quit. I'm very much on board with what people have been saying. One, I learned my decision theory from Bill in a very exciting class the year he was visiting in Pitt, my first year there permanently, so to speak, and it was a very exciting time. I have a sort of weird view about warranted credence, namely that there is a definite credence that's warranted given a certain body of evidence, but that we aren't very opinionated about what it is. We don't agree on what it is, but we have a fair amount of agreement on features of warranted credence, and to continue themes of the things that are robust under anything like reasonable credence seem very important to me. So, for instance, if we want to understand why controlled experiments give us actual causal knowledge, I think we can understand that in a sort of Bayesian way with priors over causal relations. We start from some causal truisms that we all give high credence to, like that say if we're trying to see whether children benefit from getting extra milk, then whether they would benefit from getting extra milk doesn't depend on the landing of how a coin lands doesn't depend on whether a given child would benefit from getting extra milk, and that from truisms that we expect, that we accept, and an accumulation of evidence, we come to have further causal knowledge. And I think this is the, I think Herbert Simon's early work on causal models had this feature that Pearl's work does, and CMU work does. Another instance, and I assume that this is what's driving part of what Bill is saying. As I understand it, Bill, you're stressing the importance of different measurements of parameter turning out to give the same result, widely divergent theories driving one to the same result. I take it that that's a very Bayesian sort of thing, that it's you've got a unifying theory to which you might give low initial credence, but this coincidence of a quantity is very unlikely on all the other theories, and likely on this theory. So I assume that that you're being driven by straightforward Bayesian considerations that stem from features of reasonable priors that we all share. I wish that when I dabble in reading, say, social psychology or something like that, I wish that the statistical reports were not significance tests, but an indication of how I should multiply my odds ratio in light of this result, because that again seems to be something that will stem from features of priors that everybody shares, where there's a lot of disagreement about how plausible a given hypothesis is. But if it turns out that we should be multiplying our odds ratio by 1,000,000, we should agree on. We should come close to agreeing on the hypothesis. So this is not my specialty, but whenever I think about sort of scientific evidence, it seems to me that Bayesian ways of thinking are highly relevant and might affect the practice of, for instance, the social sciences.
Asking Paul. Let's see. Well, I can't say anything against Bayesians, right? It's the only coherent view of probability reduction I know. And I think it's widely practiced in the sciences now. So is it relevant to the sciences? Sure. I mean, Bayesian methods are used all over the sciences, and I just don't think there's any argument about that. So maybe I should say something about evolutionary game theory, because that's not Bayesian. Sometimes it departs, right, from the rational choice, right? Sometimes rational choice leads you in one direction, and evolutionary dynamics leads you in another direction. But of course, what can you say? I mean, these are models of actual evolutionary processes, and they are game theoretic models are used to make predictions, right? And some of the predictions are good predictions that have been verified. The inventor of evolutionary game theory is really Ronald Fisher, right? With his analysis of sex ratio. He didn't generalize it, but that's evolutionary game theory. The analysis of sex ratio that drove sex ratio of mammals year a half has certain assumptions. Change any of the assumptions, and the predictions are different. William Hamilton looked at changing assumptions and got different predictions. Found them all verified throughout insects and different mites and different kinds of animals. So sure, this is real science.
Questions, comments from the
What do you
audience?
think?
Yeah, Bill. What do you think?
One of the, let me respond to Alan about the agreed measurements, because that's something, I mean, as you know, you published a few years ago a paper showing that Bayesians can account for the value of getting a unifying theory that predicts both two pieces of data. So think of the two diverse phenomena fitted to agreed measurements. And what Wayne showed was that to the extent that the theory is making the two pieces of the two phenomena relevant to each other when they weren't without it, that's giving you, if you just have, as long as the agents are just their degrees of belief are satisfying the probability calculus, then that's going to force the increase in the probability of the unified theory, and you can do it relative to it. And that, I think, is what the sort of thing you were talking about a Bayesian looking at agreeing measurements. Another thing that clearly a Bayesian would go along with in agreeing measurements is the stuff that Dylan Galt here was doing in his dissertation,
Over there.
looking at the role in the conversion of dark energy, because space is expanding, in cosmology today from a wild hypothesis into the standard background theory for investigating, say, galaxy clustering and other questions of cosmology. And one of the things that comes up with the agreed measurements of diverse phenomena is that to the extent that you can argue that the systematic errors that would be appropriate for each, that would be worries for each type of measurement can be regarded as independent, then getting the agreement from those independent measurements is giving you grounds for thinking that neither one of them is merely an artifact of some system. And the Bayesian has a very nice way of accommodating that. But I have not, I mean, I've also had people react to what I've been doing on Newton, and claiming that what I'm doing is a kind of a Bayesian interpretation of Newton. And I want to resist that, because I want to claim that the stuff I've been talking about with Newton, with acceptance and then revision, looking for deviations, the sort of stuff that George has talked about so effectively. This method of systematic, you think of as successively better approximations that's illustrated in the application of Newton's theory to the solar system, and that George just illustrated in a wide range, in quite different areas yesterday. In a certain sense, I want to claim that that's, you can almost do that without having any of the degrees of belief playing a role at all. You just have the acceptance context and the revisions. I have suggested that one of the things that the Bayesian model of scientific inference needs to do justice to this, to some of the significant ways that that Newton's scientific method is richer than hypothetical deductive methodology, is to make room for a notion of acceptance and revision. And to do it, and I also suggested one that's informed by this richer notion of empirical success I talked about. Now, one part of that richer notion that, if you think of, I don't know, most of you will know about Newton's moon test. So a centerpiece in the argument for universal gravitation is the moon test, where Newton argues that if you take the centripetal acceleration exhibited by the lunar orbit and adjust that to get what it would be at the surface of the Earth under the assumption it's inverse squared, then you're getting agreement with the measurement of the acceleration of gravity at the surface of the Earth with seconds pendulums. Now, one of the things we can do is illustrate, now I've been claiming that this kind of agreement is a kind of empirical success. So contrary to Ben Frassett would claim that this is just applying a general commitment to simplicity. Even Newton's first two rules of reasoning make it sound like that's all he's doing. But Newton's later rule, I won't go into the details of it, but I want to claim that one of the ways you can see that this is an empirical success is looking at the way the cruder moon test estimates are backing up the much more precise seconds pendulum estimates. And one of the things they're doing is providing more resistance to large changes. So if you just do a standard confidence estimate of a parameter, you would get with the, and you take, say, that just the data in the third edition, you would get error bounds of about almost half a foot with the moon test, and they're like a hundredth of a foot or a tenth of a foot if you did the seconds pendulum ones are much more precise.
Sorry, there's a loud.
Oh, okay. So for small, so what I want to claim is that for small differences that don't make a difference, but for big differences, the backing up from these cruder measurements provides you more resistance to large changes. Now I'm claiming that's an aspect that isn't just captured. I mean, I think Wayne's result captures a lot of what's going on, but doesn't exhaust the lessons from the agreeing measurements. And there's sort of more kinds of things. I mean, I think that the Bayesians recover a lot of the stuff. I mean, I think that certainly the stuff about the agreeing measurements that I was talking about with the dark energy and the fact that to the extent that you can regard the systematic errors as independent, you're getting this really reinforcing thing. And that's something that was there very much in Kirchner's, one of the people working in the area, in his book, and he makes it. We had these lovely quotes from him talking about it, and the Bayesian part gets that right. But there's more to be gotten about this Newton methodology and its richness over hypothetical deductive than the Bayesian models yet have got. So I think, but it doesn't mean that I think that the Bayesian stuff. I know you could actually do the Newton thing without the degrees of belief at all. That's the way George would like to do it. I mean, I'm not claiming that there aren't more ways. In fact, I really think that extending the Bayesian model to take into account these other things could be very productive and informative for both the scientific inference side and the Bayesians. That's, anyway, that you wanted to say more than that.
George, then I have a quick comment I want to make. George wants to.
I'm not going to disagree with anything Bill said, but I want to raise a slightly different topic related topic on understanding science that I've yet to see any model, idealized philosophic model, begin to address. What we leave out are questions and how they arise and how some questions become much more important than other questions. And whatever model you're going to have about acceptance, it's going to turn on certain questions being important and other questions being very much in the background, postponed until later. And I'm simply struck by the total philosophic absence of anything really useful about the nature of the relationship giving rise to. Something gives rise to a question and makes it important, other than Collingwood, and that's stuff that's wonderfly suggestive, but it doesn't begin to give a formal model. You would do more for me to understand science, I said this to von Bentham, as you recall, at that conference, to give me some sort of a formal model about how questions arise and become more and less important and spawn new questions than I would from anything about belief.
Have you got an idea for such a model?
I've tried and tried. I mean, it's tied to, the reason I'm bringing it up is it's an epistemic relationship. It's not a logical relationship. Recognizing that you have a piece of ignorance and recognizing the potential value of closing that piece of ignorance. So what I'm asking for is in these models of belief, credence, etc., find some way to put ignorance in as an identifiable element and assess the importance of the ignorance. That's the nearest I can come.
The utility as well.
Yeah,
Fine,
right.
fine.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think that I would like to see philosophers bring more decision theory into their discussions of science, because among the decisions you have are things like what line of investigation to pursue, and in part, and that's going to be, that decision is where the utilities are going to come in is the expected, and I think that it makes sense to bring in purely cognitive utilities, attach utilities to. When you bring in cognitive utilities, there's two ways to do it. One is to have a certain cognitive utility attached to accepting a proposition, and presumably you have a higher utility attached to accepting the proposition if it's true than if it's false, or that sort of thing. The other way to do it, and I think that this is a more informative way to do it, is actually attach utilities to belief states represented by probability functions, and you could talk about the expected utility of the expected change of your expected utility of your change of belief as a result of the proposed investigation. And that's one way of putting in some questions being more important than other questions. But I don't have anything to say about the gives rise to relation. I wish I did, but so I think that that's a very promising avenue of research, and I've been thinking about lately about a paper on the archive, partly because Kuhn introduced this terminology of theory choice. And I think talking about theory choice tends to obscure the many different kinds of choices we can make in dealing with choice, with theory choice. You, yesterday in your panel discussion, George, you mentioned 3 different kinds of things that you can do. You talked about accepting a theory, you talked about taking it to be true, and you talked about using it as your basis for further research. And this strikes me as 3 very different things. And in fact, I think I can do the last. I think that Bill perhaps equates the last with acceptance, but I don't think I think that's a mistake. because I could be absolutely certain the TR is false. I don't accept it, and I want to know where it breaks down. And if that's what I want to know, what I really, really want to know is what are the TR predictions in great detail, because because that's the only way, as George emphasizes, that's the only way I'm going to find the systematic deviations from the TR predictions. So I could be motivated to working with TR, working on finding out in great detail what its what its empirical predictions are, precisely because I don't accept it.
I just add one thing.
Yeah.
I mean, you used my phrase yesterday. I'm going to use it again today. I know it's just a phrase. But every time I look at science where there's an explosion of research, like the one I gave yesterday, the change is we can suddenly turn data into evidence. And I think scientists respond to that potential way past anything about how they conceptualize the world or think about it. In fact, I think they're willing to take quantum mechanics without having any idea what the solution to the measurement problem is. They use it for everything. Because, not because it's beautiful or anything else, because they can really establish results from observation. That's the other thing that I should think could fit into a Bayesian framework, of the ability to turn data into evidence.
Alan, Rhonda, did you want to if you have
So just picking up more on the basic utility in science and the role of decision theory. So I was trained first in classical statistics, and they used to tell us there are these two kinds of error, the type 1 error and the type 2 error. And the type 1 error is worse, right? And so you try and set it to some small value first, and then you worry about power later. Well, worse, I mean, how much worse? It's not infinitely worse, because you don't set the type 1 error probability to 0. That would be one way to get rid of it. So again, this just seems like a problem right for decision theory.
Because it depends on what's at stake. You know what how good the evidence you need to do in order to send I mean, the example people often use, you can do statistical testing, and one decision you might make would be to send this batch of belt buckles off to market. Another one might be to send these drugs into market, and the threshold is going to be higher in one than the other, because different things more at stake in one case than the other.
There was this other aspect of the question, though, that I want to speak to, because I think we
Could you speak up a little?
Yeah. So another aspect of the question was, I mean, sort of how exactly do we explain the questions that we were?
Yeah, science is a process of inquiry, not a process of searching for new beliefs.
Yeah, and I do think that sort of the Bayesians have to admit that there's this sort of fairly substantial sort of glaring hole in the theory, right? Which sort of has to do, in a way, with the problem that John Neerman called the problem of new hypotheses, right? I mean, and this is, I mean, in the discussion of the problem of old evidence, it turns out there are a lot of different aspects to it, but sort of one of the aspects is, gee, what is a Bayesian going to do when, it turns out some new hypothesis arises, one that you haven't already anticipated somehow in your priors? Or, I was thinking about this in connection with your talk yesterday, so we have, this paper by Dennison, which comes along and kind of proposes that, oh my goodness, maybe this thing isn't in equilibrium, right? Something that just people sort of hadn't anticipated in a way. And it's clear that those kind of episodes have, epistemic effects, right? You're introduced to a new possibility, or you realize, gee, we just haven't been thinking about this in the right way. Somebody asked a question that we haven't considered before. When I talk to my students about what would be sort of a great problem to think about, I say, well, that would be a terrific problem, except I have no idea where you'd start. But I do sort of take the point that there's this aspect of the epistemology of science that you put your finger on, that sort of the Bayesian doesn't clearly have the apparatus for it. You know,
Well, I would have thought it falls out of Bayesian theory in a way that the theory doesn't have this apparatus. At least if you take the view that there's a credence, a prior credence function that we ought to have had, but it's very difficult to know what it is at every time. So the question is, what were our prior credences? It's what should they have been, in the sense of what should we be I mean, just adopting the Bayesian picture, we will say the question is what credences ought we to conditionalize on with our total evidence, and presumably we don't know the answer every time somebody rethinks the problem theoretically. That casts light on what our prior credence ought to have been, but Bayesian methods don't answer that question. So we can say, to the extent that we can talk about features that they ought to have, we can say things, we can say Bayesian things about how this plays out and what our posterior credences ought to be, but Bayesianism doesn't tell you how to tell what the prior credences ought to be, and that's a large part. That, I suppose, is all of the a priori theory that goes into science.
There's one small thing that's in the Bayesian arsenal that is in a direction.
Could you speak up though?
There's one small thing in the Bayesian arsenal that's in the direction of what's wanted, I think, and that's the sampling the species problem. So in his notes at the end of Bayes' essay, Price is worried about there might be some new species coming in the door, right? And it's not in your prior. And how would you deal with such a thing? And this question has a light that goes through from Bayes to the present. Augustus de Morgan thought about it, and this Hoppy urn has connections with sampling species models, right, where there's something in your prior for a new guy who could walk in the door. It's leaving a little room, and it can handle some things in a nice way. There's a lot that it can't handle, so it's a small step, but it's a step in the direction of providing room for novelty to enter your model.
And there, it should be, there's this work by Isabel, which is extremely good on this. Sandy Isabel's written some papers on, this, under what conditions it sort of makes sense and how you do it to add a new species or new concept. But, it's a step in the right direction, yes.
Right. Predicting the unpredictable is the name of one of the good essays. He has ways of extending Laplace Arnott.
What's the reference to this paper?
Predicting the unpredictable.
Okay.
It's
by
in the book,
Sandy
Bill.
Isabel.
We went through that paper when we were reading through that book, remember?
Oh dear, I must be retired.
He has a recent collection of essays where a number of them are on this.
Okay.
this
Symmetry units discontent. So it is
There you
Oh, right, yes.
What is it?
Symmetry and its discontent.
Oh,
says the
Sandy
title of the
Isabel,
book.
you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay,
It's
okay,
a lovely
now-
collection of essays.
Right, yeah, okay, oh no, sorry, now I got it. Okay. Yeah.
Too bad Kevin Kelly skipped out.
Yeah, because he would have been.
Apparently his talk wasn't completely ready.
He was getting, he told me he was going to prepare his talk.
Is there any? Because what I wanted to ask Brian with Kevin in the room was whether there was any relation between the sort of learning models that you're talking about and the sort of formal learning models that Kevin likes to talk about.
It Kevin isn't here.
Yeah. So I won't ask you that question.
If he comes for wine, we can do it over.
Well, look, we did say something, and Kevin said, I said something to Kevin, and Kevin said, yeah, that's right. That's the only thing that Teddy and I ever agreed upon. I think I can say it safely, even in his absence, and that is that if you have lexicographic probabilities, then you can do everything that he's doing in a Bayesian tree. Because then, you know, you go until the thing's falsified and then you do hypothesis, and you do it with Popper functions.
Yeah, no, the Lex ordered probabilities will also recover the Popper functions and do a lot of the,
So you can do
many
all
of the probability zero stuff
Yeah.
can be done quite naturally if you're using Lex ordered probabilities. And in fact, I should say that the first real interest that I knew of economists taking to these proper functions and this sort of thing, we're looking at game theoretic situations where you want to model the agents as really committed to a certain equilibrium. And then they had to consider, relative to that, alternatives that would violate the assumptions. And one of the beautiful papers by Deckel and Brandenburger was using the Lex ordered probabilities to do it. And it recovers a proper function, essentially.
Well, Kevin's not here, but we were in the bar with him yesterday, so we know one thing that he said in connection with this. This is when he said that Bayesians speak with forked tongue, because they start with just the vanilla Kolmogorov framework and say that can do everything that we want, and then when it can't, they say, well, we didn't mean that, we mean lexically ordered, this richer framework. So Kevin was not happy about that move. Just reporting what he said at the bar.
Can I ask them a question? Direct question about my work. I have chosen somewhere in the mid-80s to intentionally try to go as vanilla neutral as possible with respect to all philosophic theories of what's going on in science. Instead, try to describe what happened historically as much as I could, because I'm afraid that if I approach it with any kind of philosophic commitment about what's going on, I'm going to distort it. Am I mistaken in that? Would I be better off or more helpful to you if I start looking at these episodes and ask what philosophic theory fits them, which I never do. I just never mention it.
I think you should keep doing what you're doing. If I did anything that well, I'd keep doing it. But
It's useful to anybody but me. It provides a lot of insight to me.
well, that's all. But I mean, there is this sort of tricky question about how to think of the relationship of sort of these Bayesian models to what actually goes on in science. And it seems to me that if you're in that business, you're really sort of well down the road to sort of rational reconstruction of what goes on rather than a picture of the actual history.
So, one way that could be interpreted is saying, well, we just should look at the history of what happened, but presumably we're at least using judgment about which things constitute science, and that people were reacting to evidence and new questions and so forth in reasonable ways. So am I right that it's not just straight recounting what happened, but a judgment of what happened reasonably?
No, I mean, what I did yesterday was pose a question that Maxwell asked in 1860, in effect, openly in 1875, get us out of this problem. And then pointed out, all of a sudden, there was a moment where there was a hope for doing so. And they managed to bring that hope about, though not easily. 13 years later, it was all in response to a question. I don't know, that's how I tend to present history. Here is a question that people struggled with for a long time, or a set of questions. What happened when they finally made headway? But that, again, doesn't fit very nicely at all into any credence model.
Why doesn't it fit?
Well, for one thing, as far as I can see, the relevance of whether any scientist believes something is very, very low compared to what they're going to find when they do a review article. That is, I'm at a state now where I'm trying to formulate an account of scientific knowledge where it's not in anybody's head. It's out in the literature to be discovered when you face a particular question. And that what individual scientists believe is just remarkably either incorrect or irrelevant most of the time until somebody makes them face the literature and see what's in it. And I'm being forced into that.
But if a famous scientist says, look, here's a problem with the theory, either this shows the theory's wrong or there's some explanation, I don't know what it is, right? And people hear that and then start working on it. I don't see how that is something that can't fit into credence models. I mean, or decision theory.
Well, maybe so. I mean, let me do just one last example. What was the complaint about Newton's theory? No account of attraction and resistance. That question never got answered. It hasn't really been answered yet. It just disappeared. When you look at the early 19th century, the question is gone. Leibniz went crazy over the question. 100 years later, nobody in science is raising it until Faraday does about a totally different matter than gravity, electricity. And we get a whole new period again of asking that question, but not about gravity. Why do questions like that disappear when they are absolutely in the forefront at the beginning?
Well, could you tell a story that there's very high initial credence that there's no such thing as action at distance, and then along comes a theory that assumes action at distance and produces remarkable concordance with the evidence, and that jacks up the tiny credence one would give to action at a distance.
Doesn't fit historically because Newton himself never for one moment apparently believed in action at a distance. Thought no rational person could possibly believe it. And so he said in the letter.
Well, but I still, no, that fits in with what Alan was talking about, because he was talking about this as a process over time. So, so Newton, what does Newton do? Without trying to construct a mechanical model for how gravitation works, he says, here, it's an inverse square attraction, and he says every body attracts everything else, and that sets a criteria that any putative model, mechanical model, is going to have to satisfy. That is what you're going to have to recover, and one way to tell the history is that the more people think about trying to recover that with a mechanical model, the more skeptical they get that it can be done. And what's wrong with that?
Well, I'm not sure many people even raised the question after Leibniz died. The question just literally starts disappearing as people, once you start making real progress in orbits, who cares what the mechanism is?
Only Euler still cared.
Well, he said so privately, but it doesn't show up in any of his work.
But he says so privately, but it doesn't show up in his work. Now, if he had a mechanical model that he thought worked, it would have showed up in his work.
He played with a model that it didn't.
And it got nowhere. Right. So that's the story. Yeah, he played with this model, it got nowhere. That's why it didn't show up in his work.
But the rest just dropped the issue. And I take it the same thing happened in your area. Hasn't that what happened with the problem of measurement in quantum mechanics? That most physicists just ignore it?
Most physicists just ignore it. That doesn't mean it's gone away.
I understand.
I think I think the fact that what's so clear from looking at the application of universal gravity to the solar system, looking at this problem of the action at a distance, is that the enormous, incredible empirical success, which you call the quality of evidence beyond what anyone dreamed before, trumps the philosophical worries about action at a distance. And you're showing similar sorts of things happening in these other fields yesterday. And I think that that's something that it's not clear to me that Bayesians can't say something illuminating about that.
It's not clear to me they can't either.
Okay.
I hope they do, but it's not something, I just feel I have to describe the best I can the epistemics of what happened. I don't describe what happened. I try to give an account of the epistemics of what happened.
Yeah, that's what I also was going to, okay, that's important. You're not just giving the history. You're making the case for the high quality of the evidence that was achieved.
But didn't we get away from the original complaint, though? That I thought it was about introducing new hypotheses, like space-time is curved or something like that, right? You really can't even talk about that question until the 20th century, you know, and so and there's not really a mechanism for the introduction of completely new, you know, slightly outside the original framework type questions that, you know, do become relevant at some point, but, you know, weren't originally.
Okay, let's look at the, I mean, I'm constantly forced, anytime somebody says something like that, look at the history. The history's Riemann. And the very idea that there could be intrinsic curvature to space, an idea that was totally beyond Newton's capacity and probably everybody else's for a long time.
Yeah, so probably 19th century.
You can ask a
Well,
question
Gauss's
about
student,
our
I mean,
space.
that was Gauss's student, and Gauss had actually done some work on alternative geometries, and he's the one that made that. I mean, Riemann gave us 3 problems that he could do, 2 of which he'd already published and was world leader in, and Gauss made him do that one. And he almost had a breakdown before he did it, too. But then that thing came out, and boy, Gauss at least could see what was achieved.
That's a good point. Gauss is said to have stood on mountaintops and tried to actually measure the curvatures. Yeah. Well, okay, so but the point was that there came a moment when people started to ask that kind of question, but before that, it was simply off the table.
But what Riemann did was to provide the framework that allows you to formulate the question in a meaningful way. And that was the achievement that Gauss could appreciate. But,
and that kind of thing does seem difficult to introduce into a Bayesian framework. I mean, that's...
To paraphrase what Tim said, I would love to have a framework in which I could talk in a systematic way about construction of new concepts which allow you to formulate hypotheses that couldn't be formulated before. And I would probably be working on that if I knew where to start. Even if I had an idea for what seemed like a fruitful starting point. But, yeah. Open to suggestions. Malcolm and John and Brad have been remarkably quiet through all this.
Well, no, I think what Wayne just said, that the invention of new concepts is critical, and that's another way of going back to James' point about the creation or the invention of new theories and hypotheses. I think that's just a way of, in my mind, just re-raising that point.
That's our storm cloud on the horizon. That's our storm cloud on the horizon. That's our ratio of specific heats. Indicates that we're going to need something new conceptually.
Yeah. I'll say something that I've thinking about a little bit recently, and it doesn't have much to do really with coming up with new concepts. I'm not sure what to say about that. But I wonder, George, what George mentioned, it was, I was recently asked to participate in a session on understanding of epistemology, and there was, so much treatment of the idea of understanding in terms of, having the right sort of sets of beliefs and the right sorts of coherence in one's sets of beliefs and so on. But it struck me that an important component of understanding, and I guess the whole point of mentioning this is that I take it that you might be you might think that scientists are looking for understanding, but my idea was that it seems to me there's a skill element involved, right? And to understand the phenomena involves not just having the right sort of beliefs or being aware of a certain sort of theory that has certain implications, but to understand it is to have skill in deploying the theory. And the skill is, I take it, an epistemic skill that's subject, subject specific to a certain extent. And so I don't really know where to go with this except to say that if you're focusing so much on thinking about science and what scientists are up to and maybe what their goals are, and you cast everything in terms of sets of propositions or theories deployed, sets of beliefs, and you leave out this element, it seems like something's missing. I don't know how, I guess I thought of this when you're thinking about asking for how to distinguish or how to explain when questions are significant. It seems to me an element that's relevant, but I don't think I can say much now.
John, your turn.
I'm too tired.
Can we wrap it up?
Can I say one thing
Yes.
from Bill and my paper from 1992? It's about Newton. And one of the first sentences in that paper. And what distinguished Newton from everybody else at the time, and probably for most people to this day, is he thought there was a distinction in kind between a properly established scientific fact and conjecture, and the whole of the Principia can be read as driving home that distinction. What's conjecture is conjecture, it's not allowed in the book. And he did so with a rigor that's just astounding in lots of ways. Very few people read it that way, not surprisingly, because it seems like a strange idea. But that drove him much more than any inquiries about the world, etc., because he wasn't that interested in physics. In his whole career, the smallest single thing he put time into was the physics of the planetary system. He put enormously more time into theology, chemistry, and even optics than he did.
So here was the place where he could deliver.
And that's what he thought. And that's what he said. And Bill, that's what he said in the preface to the first edition. He had found a new way to do science in which you could argue more securely.
Okay, thank you.